Hey, I'm Lauren Schaefer, a developer advocate at MongoDB. In this video series, I've been using MongoDB Stitch to build a very basic blogging application. So far, I've been using anonymous authentication since I've only been storing public data, and I didn't have any features that required authentication. But most applications are going to move beyond anonymous authentication pretty quickly and need to allow for users to sign in. This is a fairly repetitive task that almost every application needs, so Stitch has built-in authentication providers to make implementing authentication as painless and fast as possible. As always, let's begin with a quick look at the architecture diagram. We already have anonymous authentication enabled. Today, I'll add a Google authentication provider that will interact with Google's third-party service to authenticate users. With Google Authentication, users can authenticate using their existing Google accounts, which is handy for them, so they don't have to create a new account just to use your app. So let's start implementing. I'm going to head over to the Users section of the Stitch UI. As you can see, in addition to anonymous authentication, Stitch offers 4 types of built-in authentication methods: email password, Facebook, Google, and API keys. You also have the option of using a custom authentication provider. Today, I'm going to show you how to enable Google Authentication. So I'll open that up. I'll begin by enabling it. The form asks for my client ID and client secret. To get these values, I needed to do a little setup in the Google API console, which I did before I started recording. At a high level, I created a new project and generated new credentials. Note that I added an authorized redirect URI. The Stitch documentation details exactly what value you should put here. I'll copy the client ID and the client secret into the Stitch UI. The next field here is the redirect URI. This is the URI your users will be redirected to after they successfully authenticate. I'm going to create a special login page that handles logging people in, as well as redirecting people back to the page they were previously on. I'll create that in just a moment. I'm going to skip over domain restrictions for now. Finally, I have the metadata fields options. This is information that I want to be able to access about my users. In this case, I'm going to write some very basic code that welcomes authenticated users by name, so I'll check the first name box. And let's save this. So let's start setting up our authentication in our code. I'm going to begin by creating login.html. This page is going to serve 2 purposes. First, it will allow users to authenticate. Second, it will handle redirecting users back to the page they were on when they requested to authenticate. So let's write the first part that allows users to log in. I'll add some basic HTML, head, and body tags. Since we're using Stitch, we'll need to access the Stitch SDK and the Stitch client. I'm going to copy those lines over from the blog.html page I created in a previous video. If you're ever looking for this code, you can find it in the Stitch Getting Started guide. Remember, I have anonymous authentication enabled, and any user who goes to blog.html will be authenticated anonymously. So let's begin by logging them out. Then let's do a couple of things. First, I'll store the URL of the page that the user was on previously. This will allow me to redirect back to that page after they've authenticated. I'll use local storage and set the redirect URL to document.referrer. Now let's authenticate. I'll create a new credential using stitch.googleRedirectCredential. Then I'll send the user to authenticate by calling client.auth.login with redirect and the credential parameter. At this point, the user will be redirected to a Google authentication page that Google hosts. Once the user inputs their credentials, Google will confirm or deny their identity and ask if they want to share their data with the application. Google will then redirect to Stitch, and Stitch will redirect the user back to the redirect URI. If you'll recall from earlier in this video, I set the redirect URI to login.html. So I'll handle that redirect here. Let's check to see if we have a redirect result. If we do, I'll handle it. Then let's pull that redirect URL out of local storage. If we don't have a redirect URL, maybe the user navigated directly to the login page, I'll set the redirect URL to our home page, which is index.html. Finally, let's redirect the user back to that URL. Okay, so we have our login page taken care of. Now we need to call it. Let's return to our blog.html. Let's add a script to the top of our page body. If the user is logged in with Google, let's welcome them. Otherwise, let's add a link to the login page. The last thing I'm going to do is scroll up to the top and update our page's head. Here I have some boilerplate code from our Getting Started guide that logs users in using anonymous credentials. I'm going to refactor this a bit. I'll begin by creating a login function. Let's check if the user is already logged in. If they are, I don't need to do anything. I can add a logging statement and send back an empty promise resolution. If they are not logged in, let's log in using anonymous authentication. I'm going to copy the authentication code from up here and paste it down in my new function. I'll change this to a return statement, and then I'll add a logging statement as well. Now I'm going to replace the login call up here with a call to my new login function. I'm going to go back to the Stitch UI and upload new copies of blog.html and login.html. Now let's test out our authentication. Here we can see the new Login with Google link. Watch the URL as I click the link. It was a very quick redirect, but you may have been able to see that I was redirected to the login.html page and then was immediately redirected again to the authentication page that Google hosts. Here I can authenticate. Again, watch the URL as I authenticate. I'm redirected to login.html and sent back to the page I was originally on, blog.html. And here we can see I'm being greeted by name. Pretty nice. If we take a step back and consider what I just did to enable authentication on my site, it really wasn't too painful. I set up a project in Google Cloud Platform and generated some keys. I did a little configuring in the Stitch UI, and I wrote a few lines of code in my app. Now, my users can successfully authenticate to my blog. The code I wrote was for a very basic use case, and bigger use cases would require a bit more code. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how Stitch can simplify the authentication process and prevent you from having to write a bunch of boilerplate authentication code yourself. I hope you've enjoyed this video series. Bye for now.